I am disappointed. I am disappointed in the fact that as a society and as individuals, we have moved from a framework of being curious about one another to a framework of being judgmental about one another. When we judge others, it's primarily on the foundation of differences. These differences can be related to things such as race, gender, sexual orientation, class, age, but these differences can also be cultural. And that's what I would like to focus on. So to better understand and to be curious about cultural differences, I think we need to talk about two important concepts. Number one, what exactly is culture? And number two, what is the cycle of socialization? Let's start with the concept of culture. I'm an instructor of multicultural leadership, and when I ask my students, what is culture? The typical responses I get are the tangible forms of culture, which can include things like clothing, music, and food. But in reality, clothing is so much more than the tangible things we can see, hear, and feel. These aspects are just the tip of the culture iceberg. But what about everything below the water that we can't see? Edgar Schein, a world-renowned expert on organizational culture, explains that the culture of a group can be defined as the accumulated shared learning of that group as it solves its problems of external adaptation and internal integration, which has worked well enough to be considered valid. Therefore, to be taught to its new members as the correct way to perceive, think, feel, and behave in relation to those problems. In other words, culture is everywhere. Yes, it's the things at the tip of the iceberg, but it's also so much more. Culture is the entire way of life for a group. It's how a group perceives, thinks, feels, and behaves as it navigates throughout society. So where does the cycle come into play? Well, let me ask you a few questions. Have you ever asked yourself why you perceive, think, feel, and behave in a certain way? I mean, truly, how often do we take the time to self-reflect about where our thoughts and actions stem from? How and why do we navigate the problems of the world in a particular demeanor? Well, the cycle of socialization gives us a conceptual framework that helps us understand the how and the why. So in the beginning of the cycle of socialization, we are born into this world with no preconceived notions of the many differences we talked about earlier. However, as we are surrounded by the individuals we are most dependent upon and spend the most time with, we experience our first socialization. We start to adopt their feelings, their perceptions of the world, and then we see these feelings and perceptions manifesting either congruently or incongruently because of the institutional structures we are introduced to. Our school systems, places of worship, things we see and hear in the media, the legal system are all examples of the structures in society that contribute to shaping our point of view. As we begin to see the norms and notions of what society expects, we encounter a bombardment of both positive and negative enforcements that reinforces the messages we received earlier. As a result of these enforcements, we are conditioned in a manner that dictates how we should, again, perceive, think, feel, and behave as we navigate throughout society. At this point, we are a product of socialization, and we are left with really just two options. Option one is to continue the cycle that perpetuates the status quo, because at the core of it all, we are either ignorant, insecure, confused, oblivious, or fearful of what happens if we choose option two. And option two is to disrupt that cycle and to take action towards change. I know that the cycle is a lot to grasp and take in, so I want to tell you a story to help explain how the cycle of socialization occurred in the life of someone with a culture and identity that fell outside of what we would consider the norm. This is the story of a good friend of mine. And for the sake of anonymity, I'll use the name John to talk about his experience. Let me begin by giving you some contextual facts about John. John is the son of immigrants who left their home to escape their war-torn country with the hopes of pursuing what we would call the American dream. John grew up in a small rural community where less than 1% of the population looked like him. John can also be considered an ESL. ESL stands for English as a Second Language. Now, what does this all look like in the cycle, right? Well, John was born into this world with no preconceived notions of the many differences we talked about earlier. And John experienced his first socialization when he was surrounded by his family members. He noticed the hard work ethic of his mother and father, the studious nature of his brothers, and the deep sense of pride in their culture as they celebrated traditions and holidays throughout the year. However, once John became old enough to enter the school system, he quickly realized that his first socialization wasn't congruent with society's expectations. He realized that he was different and that there were differences, and that these differences would be the center of attention for all the new people introduced into his life moving forward. And based off of these differences alone, he started to get treated as an other. In the classroom, there were always chuckles and laughter as the teacher would try to pronounce his name for roll call. Because they couldn't pronounce his name, they ended up giving him a whole new name in general. Because English wasn't his primary language, his peers knew he struggled with reading and writing. So as the class would read a textbook out loud and popcorn to take turns, they would continuously call on him to read so they can laugh while he struggled. When everyone found out that his parents did hair and nails for a living, they often judged and made stereotypical jokes as if their profession and methods for providing for their family were less than. He experienced these various forms of negative enforcements every single day. The constant mental and physical harassment that he continuously suffered reinforced the notion that there was a correct way to perceive, think, feel, and behave as he navigated throughout society. As a result, he wanted nothing more than to fit in with the norm. So he abandoned everything that would distinguish him as different. He begged his parents to buy him the clothes that the popular students were wearing, or to buy the things that they all had so he could blend in as best as he could. He was quick to stop eating the food that his mother and father cooked every single night, not because he didn't like the taste, because of what it represented, a different culture. He stopped speaking his native language and eventually lost the ability and confidence to speak the language altogether. He was embarrassed of his family, and he was embarrassed of the culture of his people. He even went as far as abandoning his given name and adopting the name that the teachers gave him in the school system. Now, what those teachers and students didn't know about John is that his name held significant cultural meaning to his family. You see, when John's mom was pregnant, his grandmother was terminally ill. But John's grandmother promised his mom that she would live long enough to see the birth of her grandchild. And that's what she did. On June 26, 1994, John was born. It was actually his grandmother who named him, and moments later, she passed away that very same day. In their native language, John's name means phoenix, and mythology tells us that as a phoenix dies, it obtains new life by rising from the ashes of its predecessor. For a majority of John's life, he would continue the cyclical nature of the cycle, abandoning stories like this and everything to do with his culture out of the fear of being judged. So why does John's story matter? Well, I often think about John and his story, and I wonder, what would it look like if people were more culturally curious rather than judgmental? Maybe in the classroom, the teachers and peers took the time to ask, "Can you help me pronounce your name?" And maybe that leads to John explaining the story of his name and its connection to their culture and family history. Maybe instead of judging the fact that John's primary language wasn't English, maybe his peers celebrated his ability to speak multiple languages. Maybe that results in John being able to communicate and build meaningful relationships with his family members who don't speak English. Maybe instead of belittling the profession of his parents, John would be given the space to tell the stories of everything that they had to overcome and accomplish to provide a better life for their family. And don't these maybes sound like things worth celebrating? In order to make room to celebrate these things, we need to be curious. So what does that look like? How might one become more curious? I don't think there's one specific answer, but I think it starts with asking questions, being a little bit vulnerable, sharing your story every chance you get, and appreciating the way that others share their stories with you, and ultimately being okay with being uncomfortable. It's not always easy to be curious, but it's vital in order to create and sustain a community that acknowledges, appreciates, and celebrates differences. If you haven't guessed it yet, I am John, and that was and still is my story. I told you this story because I wanted to show you all how real and prevalent the cycle of socialization is, and how it causes us to judge others based on differences, instead of being curious about those differences. I told you this story because for my entire life, I have conformed to the cycle of socialization and accepted the status quo. But this is a step towards disrupting that cycle by sharing my story. I want to leave you all with one final sentiment. When we lose our cultural curiosity, we start accepting things as the norm, giving ourselves permission to judge everything that does not fit that criteria. So let's reframe that narrative and give ourselves permission to be curious. Thank you.